April 18, 1943, 5:30 hours. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. Captain Thomas Lanphier, Jr., 24 years old from Detroit, Michigan, stood beside his P-38 Lightning fighter in the pre-dawn darkness, studying a folded map by flashlight. The map showed a route stretching 435 miles across enemy-controlled ocean, wave-top height the entire way to avoid Japanese radar, navigating by compass and dead reckoning with zero margin for error, arriving at a precise point at a precise moment, with only 2 minutes to accomplish what would become the most carefully planned assassination in American military history. The target was not a military installation, not a supply depot, not a naval base. The target was one man, Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, 59, Commander-in-Chief of the Combined Fleet of the Imperial Japanese Navy, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan's most brilliant naval strategist, the man American intelligence considered irreplaceable. And in 6 hours, if everything went according to plan, Admiral Yamamoto would be dead. Lanphier glanced at his wingman, Lieutenant Rex Barber, 23 from Culver, Oregon, who was performing final pre-flight checks on his own P-38. 15 other pilots prepared their aircraft in the darkness. 18 fighters total for a mission that required absolute precision, perfect timing, flawless execution, and extraordinary luck. They would fly further over enemy territory than any previous fighter mission in the Pacific War. They would navigate without radio communication to avoid detection. They would arrive within seconds of the predicted intercept time. And they would attempt to shoot down Japan's supreme naval commander while he flew in a heavily escorted transport aircraft protected by the most experienced Zero fighter pilots in the Japanese Navy. The odds of success seemed impossibly small. The odds of survival seemed even smaller. But the opportunity was unprecedented. American codebreakers had intercepted and decrypted Japanese radio traffic, revealing Yamamoto's exact flight plan. Departure time, route, destination, escort composition. The Admiral would be flying from Rabaul to Bin on Bougainville Island to inspect forward bases. His aircraft would be a Mitsubishi G4M Betty bomber configured as a transport. His escort would be 6 Zero fighters. He would depart Rabaul at 6 o'clock hours and arrive Bin at 8 o'clock hours. The Americans knew everything, and now they faced a decision that would haunt some of them for the rest of their lives. Was targeted assassination of an enemy commander justified? Was it murder or legitimate military action? And if they succeeded, would Japan replace Yamamoto with someone more competent or less competent? These philosophical questions have been debated at the highest levels of American command. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, had presented the intelligence to his staff. Some officers argued that assassinating Yamamoto was dishonorable, violated the code of warfare, reduced America to the level of the enemy. Others argued that Yamamoto had planned Pearl Harbor, that he bore personal responsibility for 2,400 American deaths, that eliminating him was both justice and strategic necessity. The debate reached Washington. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox consulted with President Franklin Roosevelt. The president's response was unequivocal. Get Yamamoto. The order went back through channels to the South Pacific. Admiral William Halsey, Commander South Pacific Area, assigned the mission to the Army Air Force's 339th Fighter Squadron, the most experienced P-38 unit in theater. Major John Mitchell, 28 from Mississippi, was designated mission commander. His orders were simple and absolute. Intercept Yamamoto's flight, shoot down his aircraft, confirm the kill. Now, in the darkness of Henderson Field on April 18th, 1943, 18 American pilots prepared to execute those orders. What none of them fully understood was that this mission, successful or not, would establish precedents that would echo through decades of American military and intelligence operations. Targeted killing of enemy leaders would become standard doctrine. The moral and legal debates would continue for 70 years. And the question of whether Operation Vengeance was America's finest hour or most troubling decision would never be fully resolved. If you enjoy deep dive military history like this, hit subscribe. It helps us bring you more untold stories from World War II and beyond. And if you're already here for the story, thank you. Let's continue. Now, back to the intelligence breakthrough that made Operation Vengeance possible. The story begins not in the South Pacific, but in Hawaii, in a windowless basement room at Pearl Harbor, where a team of Navy cryptanalysts worked around the clock breaking Japanese naval codes. This unit, designated Station HYPO, operated in absolute secrecy. Even most Navy officers did not know it existed. But by April 1943, the codebreakers of Station HYPO had achieved what many military experts considered impossible. They could read encrypted Japanese radio traffic almost as quickly as the intended Japanese recipients. The Japanese Navy used a cipher system designated JN-25 by American intelligence. The system was complex, employing codebooks that converted words and phrases into 5-digit number groups, which were then encrypted using additive tables that changed the numbers according to mathematical formulas. Breaking JN-25 required not just mathematical skill, but linguistic expertise in Japanese, understanding of naval terminology, pattern recognition across thousands of intercepted messages, and occasionally pure intuition about what the Japanese might be planning. The cryptanalytic team at Station HYPO was led by Commander Joseph Rochefort, 43, a career Navy officer who had spent years studying Japanese language and culture. Rochefort was brilliant, obsessive, and utterly committed to providing intelligence that would help America win the Pacific War. He worked in the basement wearing a smoking jacket and slippers because the air conditioning made the space freezing cold, chain-smoking cigarettes, sleeping 3 or 4 hours per night, driven by the conviction that every intercepted message might contain information that could save American lives. On April 13, 1943, 5 days before Operation Vengeance, Rochefort's team intercepted a Japanese radio transmission originating from Rabaul, the major Japanese base on New Britain Island. The message was encrypted using JN-25, but Station HYPO had recently made significant progress breaking the current version of the cipher. Within hours, the cryptanalysts had decrypted enough of the message to understand its significance. The message outlined Admiral Yamamoto's planned inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. It specified exact times, locations, aircraft types, and escort composition. The level of detail was extraordinary and, from an American perspective, almost unbelievable. The Japanese were providing complete information about the movements of their most senior naval commander, transmitted via radio that they apparently believed was secure. Rochefort immediately recognized the intelligence value and the operational opportunity. He drafted an urgent message to Admiral Nimitz at Pacific Fleet Headquarters, marked with the highest security classification. The message provided the decrypted intelligence and included Rochefort's assessment. This presents an exceptional opportunity. Recommend immediate action. The message reached Nimitz within hours. The Admiral convened an emergency meeting with his senior staff to discuss options. The intelligence was specific enough to enable an interception attempt, but the challenges were formidable. Yamamoto would be flying from Rabaul, one of the most heavily defended Japanese bases in the Pacific, to bid on Bougainville, another strongly held position. The flight path would be entirely over ocean and islands controlled by Japanese forces. Any American aircraft attempting an interception would be operating 400-plus miles from friendly bases, beyond the range of most fighters. But Nimitz had one asset that might make a mission possible: the P-38 Lightning. The twin-engine, twin-boom fighter had been deployed to the South Pacific in late 1942 and had proven itself capable of long-range missions that single-engine fighters could not attempt. With external fuel tanks, a P-38 could fly over 800 miles, sufficient to reach the intercept point and return to Henderson Field, though with almost no fuel margin for combat maneuvering. Nimitz authorized preliminary planning. His staff calculated flight times, fuel consumption, navigation requirements, and intercept geometry. The numbers were tight, but feasible. If American fighters departed Henderson Field at the correct time, flew at the correct altitude and speed, navigated with perfect precision, and arrived at the predicted intercept point within a 2-minute window, they would encounter Yamamoto's flight. If they arrived 3 minutes early, the Japanese would not yet be there. If they arrived 3 minutes late, the Japanese would already have landed. The margin for error was measured in seconds and miles. But even before addressing the tactical challenges, Nimitz faced a moral and strategic question. Should America attempt to assassinate Admiral Yamamoto? The question of whether targeted killing of enemy commanders constituted legitimate warfare or criminal assassination had been debated since ancient times. Traditional military ethics held that officers were legitimate targets in combat, but that deliberate assassination outside of battle violated the laws of war. Yet the distinction between killing an enemy commander in combat versus killing him in a carefully planned ambush was philosophically ambiguous. Some of Nimitz's staff argued strongly against the operation. They pointed out that Yamamoto was a military officer wearing a uniform, traveling in a clearly marked military aircraft in a war zone. But the mission was not random combat. It was premeditated killing based on intelligence interception. If the roles were reversed and Japan had attempted to assassinate an American admiral, the United States would denounce it as a war crime. Others countered that Yamamoto bore personal responsibility for Pearl Harbor, an attack that many Americans still consider treacherous despite its technical legality. Yamamoto had planned the operation in detail. He had pushed for approval despite opposition from other Japanese commanders. The December 7, 1941 attack killed 2,403 Americans and wounded 1,178 more. If anyone in the Japanese military deserved to be killed, Yamamoto was at the top of the list. There was also a strategic argument. Intelligence assessments suggested that Yamamoto was Japan's most competent naval commander. His strategic vision, tactical skill, and personal leadership were considered exceptional. If he were killed, Japan would likely replace him with someone less capable. This alone could shift the naval balance in the Pacific significantly in America's favor. But there was a counterargument to this strategic logic. What if killing Yamamoto turned him into a martyr? What if his death galvanized Japanese resistance rather than weakening it? What if Japan replaced him with someone more aggressive, more willing to take risks, more dangerous? Nimitz listened to all arguments, then made his decision. The mission would proceed, but final authorization required approval from Washington. He transmitted the intelligence to Navy Secretary Frank Knox with a request for guidance. Knox consulted with President Roosevelt. Roosevelt's response was immediate and unambiguous. Get Yamamoto. The president provided no elaboration, no justification, no moral reasoning. Just 3 words. The mission was authorized. Years later, historians would debate Roosevelt's decision. Some would argue it was pragmatic realism, eliminate the enemy's best commander and win the war faster, saving American lives. Others would argue it established a dangerous precedent that would lead to decades of controversial targeted killings. But in April 1943, with the Pacific War's outcome still uncertain, the decision was simply operational. America had an opportunity to kill Japan's supreme naval commander, and that opportunity would not be wasted. To understand why Admiral Yamamoto was considered such a significant target, it is necessary to understand who he was, what he represented, and why both American intelligence and Japanese leadership viewed him as irreplaceable. Isoroku Yamamoto was born in 1884 in Nagaoka, Niigata Prefecture, Japan. His birth name was Isoroku Takano. He was adopted into the Yamamoto family in 1916 when he was 32 years old. Following samurai tradition, he entered the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy in 1901 at age 16 and graduated in 1904, ranking 7th in his class of 191 cadets. Yamamoto's early naval career coincided with Japan's emergence as a major naval power. He served as a junior officer during the Russo-Japanese War in 1904 to 1905, participating in the Battle of Tsushima, where the Japanese fleet destroyed the Russian Baltic Fleet in one of the most decisive naval victories in history. During that battle, Yamamoto lost 2 fingers on his left hand to shrapnel, an injury that became his identifying feature. Unlike many Japanese officers of his generation, Yamamoto spent significant time in the United States. He studied at Harvard University from 1919 to 1921, learning English and studying American industrial capacity, culture, and military potential. He later served as a naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928. These experiences gave him unique insights that most Japanese military leaders lacked. He understood that America's industrial production capacity vastly exceeded Japan's, that American resources were nearly unlimited, and that any war between Japan and the United States that lasted more than a year would inevitably result in Japanese defeat. This understanding shaped Yamamoto's strategic thinking throughout his career. In the 1930s, as Japan moved toward military expansion and eventual conflict with Western powers, Yamamoto consistently argued against war with America. He opposed Japan's alliance with Nazi Germany. He warned that fighting America would be catastrophic. When asked by Prime Minister Fumimaro Kono in 1940 about Japan's prospects in a war with America, Yamamoto replied, "If ordered to fight, I can promise to give them hell for 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the 2nd or 3rd year." This prediction was both accurate and prophetic. When war became inevitable despite his opposition, Yamamoto planned an operation designed to give Japan the best possible chance in the opening phase, a surprise attack on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. The operation was tactically brilliant, but strategically flawed. It achieved surprise, sank or damaged 8 battleships, and temporarily crippled American naval power in the Pacific. But it also unified American public opinion, ensured that America would fight a total war until Japan was completely defeated, and ultimately guaranteed the Japanese defeat that Yamamoto had predicted. By April 1943, 16 months after Pearl Harbor, Yamamoto's prediction was proving accurate. Japan had won stunning victories in the first 6 months of war, conquering vast territories across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. But American industrial production was now fully mobilized. New warships were being completed at rates Japan could not match. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines. And at midway in June 1942, American naval aviators had sunk 4 Japanese fleet carriers in a single battle, permanently shifting the naval balance in the Pacific. Yamamoto understood the strategic situation better than most Japanese officers. He knew Japan was losing. He knew the war could not be won. But he also knew he had a duty to fight as effectively as possible to preserve Japanese lives and honor while seeking some negotiated settlement that would allow Japan to exit the war with dignity. It was this combination of factors, Yamamoto's exceptional competence, his realistic assessment of Japan's strategic position, his influence over Japanese naval operations, and his role in planning Pearl Harbor, that made him such a valuable target for American intelligence. Killing Yamamoto would not win the war immediately, but it would deprive Japan of its best naval commander at a critical moment when American forces were preparing major offensives in the Central and Southwest Pacific. And so, on April 18, 1943, 18 American pilots prepared to execute a mission that would attempt to do what no previous operation had accomplished: kill Japan's most senior military commander in a carefully planned ambush based on intercepted communications. The mission's code name was Operation Vengeance, a name that explicitly acknowledged the emotional and moral dimensions of targeted assassination. The revenge for Pearl Harbor was about to begin. Major John Mitchell, 28, from Enid, Mississippi, received the operational order for Operation Vengeance on April 17, 1943, less than 24 hours before scheduled execution. The tight timeline reflected both the urgency of the opportunity and the need for absolute operational security. Every additional day that passed increased the risk that Japanese intelligence might somehow detect unusual American preparations, or that Yamamoto might change his schedule. Mitchell was commander of the 339th Fighter Squadron, one of 3 squadrons in the 347th Fighter Group operating P-38 Lightnings from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. He had arrived in the South Pacific in December 1942 and had logged over 80 combat missions, making him one of the most experienced fighter pilots in theater. But this mission would be unlike anything he had previously attempted. The operational order specified the target, the timeline, and the basic requirement: intercept and destroy Admiral Yamamoto's aircraft. Everything else, route, altitude, speed, formation, tactics, Mitchell had to determine himself within hours. The first challenge was navigation. The intercept point would be near Bougainville Island, approximately 435 miles northwest of Henderson Field. The flight would be entirely over water or enemy-held islands. P-38s would fly at wave-top altitude, 50 feet or lower, to avoid detection by Japanese radar installations. At that altitude, navigation would be by compass and dead reckoning only. No landmarks, no radio beacons, no communication with ground controllers. Mitchell spread maps across the briefing room table and began calculations. Flying at 200 miles per hour, the optimal cruising speed for fuel economy. The transit would take approximately 130 minutes. Adding time for climb, combat, and return, the total mission would last roughly 5 hours. P-38s with standard internal fuel could fly approximately 4 hours. With external drop tanks carrying an additional 310 gallons, maximum flight time extended to about 6 hours, giving perhaps 45 minutes of fuel margin. But that margin assumed perfect conditions. No headwinds, no combat maneuvering, no deviations from planned route. Any significant combat would burn additional fuel. Any navigation errors would extend flight time. If the mission took longer than planned, pilots would run out of fuel and crash into the ocean. The timing was equally critical. Yamamoto's aircraft was scheduled to depart Rabaul at 6 o'clock hours and arrive in at 8 o'clock hours, a 2-hour flight. Japanese bombers flew at approximately 180 miles per hour. Working backward from the predicted arrival time and the known distance from Rabaul to Bin, Mitchell calculated that Yamamoto would be approaching Bin's southern coast at approximately 7:35 hours local time, flying at 4,500 feet altitude, according to standard Japanese procedures. American fighters would need to depart Henderson Field at 7:10 hours to arrive at the intercept point at 7:35 hours. The timing window was brutally narrow. Arrive 2 minutes early and wait, burning fuel while exposed over enemy territory. Arrive 2 minutes late, and Yamamoto would already have landed. The intercept had to occur within a 120-second window after a 2.5-hour flight covering 435 miles. Mitchell studied the numbers again. The mission was possible, but barely. Every factor had to align perfectly. There was no backup plan. If anything went wrong, aircraft mechanical failure, navigation error, unexpected weather, stronger than predicted headwinds, the mission would fail. The second major challenge was aircraft selection and pilot assignment. Mitchell had 25 P-38 Lightnings available in his squadron. Of those, 18 were fully mission-capable with reliable engines, functioning instruments, and no significant maintenance issues. He selected those 18 aircraft and began assigning pilots. The mission would employ two groups: a killer flight of 4 aircraft tasked with directly attacking Yamamoto's bomber, and a cover flight of 14 aircraft tasked with engaging the Japanese Zero escort and protecting the killer flight from interference. Mitchell assigned his most aggressive pilots to the killer flight: Captain Thomas Lanphier Jr., Lieutenant Rex Barber, Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Raymond Hine. Lanphier, 24, was the son of a U.S. Army Air Force general and had grown up in military culture. He was confident, ambitious, and eager for combat glory. He had scored 3 confirmed kills since arriving in the South Pacific and was considered one of the squadron's best pilots. Mitchell designated him killer flight leader. Barber, 23, was quieter, more methodical, less interested in glory than in completing missions successfully. He had scored for confirmed kills and was known for precise flying and excellent marksmanship. He would fly as Lanphier's wingman. Holmes and Hine were similarly experienced, with multiple kills each. Their job would be to attack Yamamoto's second transport aircraft. Intelligence indicated 2 Betty bombers would fly together, and provide backup if Lanphier and Barber encountered difficulties. The 14 cover aircraft would be led by Mitchell himself. Their task was to engage the 6 Zero escorts and prevent them from interfering with the killer flight's attack. This would require disciplined formation flying and perfect timing. If the cover flight engaged too early, they would alert the Japanese before the killer flight reached attack position. If they engaged too late, the Zeros might shoot down the killer flight before they could attack Yamamoto. On the evening of April 17th, Mitchell assembled the 18 selected pilots in a secure briefing room. Marine guards were posted outside. No one without proper authorization was allowed to enter. The pilots knew something unusual was happening. Security was tighter than normal. Mitchell looked more serious than usual, and the mission folder on the briefing table was marked with the highest classification levels. Mitchell opened the briefing without preamble. "Tomorrow morning we're going to kill Admiral Yamamoto." The room went silent. Several pilots sat up straighter. A few exchanged glances. Everyone knew who Yamamoto was. The architect of Pearl Harbor, the supreme commander of Japan's fleet, the enemy's most senior naval officer. Mitchell continued. "Intelligence has intercepted and decrypted Japanese radio traffic, giving us Yamamoto's exact itinerary for tomorrow. He'll be flying from Rabaul to Ben on a scheduled inspection tour. We know his departure time, his route, his arrival time, and his aircraft type. We will intercept his flight at 7:35 hours, approximately 35 miles southwest of Ben." He unfolded a map showing the route from Henderson Field to the intercept point. The distance was staggering, further than any of them had flown on a combat mission. The timing precision required was daunting. "We'll fly at wave-top altitude to avoid radar detection. Radio silence the entire way. Navigation by compass and dead reckoning. We depart at 7:10 hours. Flight time approximately 2 hours, 25 minutes. We hit the intercept point at exactly 7:35. We shoot down Yamamoto's aircraft. We return to Henderson. Any questions?" The questions came fast. What about fuel? What if we encounter Japanese fighters before reaching the intercept? What if Yamamoto's flight doesn't show up? What if weather prevents us from flying at 50 feet? What's the backup plan if something goes wrong? Mitchell answered each question honestly. Yes, fuel would be critically tight. They would have perhaps 30 minutes margin, maybe less if they encountered headwinds. No, there was no backup plan. If they missed the intercept, the mission was over. Yes, flying at 50 feet for 2.5 hours was dangerous. Any pilot who became disoriented or made an error would crash into the ocean. And yes, if Yamamoto's flight was delayed or rerouted, the entire mission would fail. Captain Lanphier asked a question several pilots were thinking. "Sir, is this assassination or legitimate combat?" Mitchell paused before answering. He had asked himself the same question. He had received no guidance from higher command about the moral dimensions, only operational orders. The Admiral is wearing a uniform, flying in a military aircraft in a combat zone during wartime. That makes him a legitimate military target. We're not sneaking into his headquarters to poison him. We're not sending saboteurs to blow up his quarters. We're intercepting a military flight and shooting it down. That's combat. Any other questions? There were no other questions. The pilots understood the mission and its implications. They also understood that this would be the most significant combat mission any of them would ever fly. If they succeeded, they would have killed Japan's most senior commander. If they failed, they would likely die trying, either shot down over enemy territory or crashing into the ocean when their fuel ran out. Mitchell dismissed the briefing with final instructions. Get full rest tonight. Eat a good breakfast. Pre-flight your aircraft thoroughly. Check everything twice. We launch at exactly 7:10 hours. Not 7:11. Not 7:09. Exactly 7:10. Synchronize your watches now. The pilots synchronize their watches to Mitchell's timepiece. In military operations, precision timing can mean the difference between success and failure. In Operation Vengeance, that timing will be measured in seconds. While American pilots prepared at Henderson Field, Admiral Yamamoto was at Rabaul making final preparations for his inspection tour. The visit was routine. Senior commanders regularly traveled to forward bases to inspect conditions, boost morale, and demonstrate that leadership was engaged with frontline personnel. Yamamoto had made dozens of similar trips during his career, but this trip involved more risk than usual. The Solomon Islands were contested territory. American forces held Guadalcanal. Japanese forces held Bougainville, New Georgia, and other islands in the chain. Air combat occurred daily. Operating in the region meant accepting elevated risk of interception or attack. Some of Yamamoto's staff had expressed concerns about the trip. Captain Yasuji Watanabe, his senior staff officer, recommended postponing or canceling due to security concerns. Radio communications about the Admiral's movements had been increasing, and there was always risk that American intelligence might be monitoring Japanese radio traffic. Yamamoto dismissed the concerns. Japanese officers believed their codes were unbreakable. The JN-25 cipher system was complex, changed regularly, and had never been compromised as far as they knew. The possibility that Americans were reading their communications seemed remote. More fundamentally, Yamamoto believed that commanders had a duty to visit frontline units to show that leadership shared risks with common soldiers and sailors. Canceling the visit for security concerns would send the wrong message, that senior officers were afraid that they stayed safe while subordinates faced danger. So on the evening of April 17th, Yamamoto confirmed that the inspection tour would proceed as scheduled. He would depart Rabaul at 6 o'clock hours aboard a Mitsubishi G4M bomber configured as a transport. A second G4M would carry members of his staff. 6 Zero fighters would provide escort. The flight would take 2 hours, arriving at Bin at 8 o'clock hours for scheduled meetings with Army and Navy commanders in the area. Yamamoto spent the evening reviewing reports and writing letters. He was 59 years old, tired from 2 years of war, aware that Japan's strategic position was deteriorating. He had tried to warn his government that war with America was unwinnable. His warnings had been ignored. Now he had a duty to fight as effectively as possible, even though he knew the war was lost. One of his aides would later recall that Yamamoto seemed unusually reflective that evening, as if sensing that something significant was about to happen. But this may be retrospective interpretation, finding meaning in ordinary moments because of what came after. More likely, Yamamoto was simply tired, thinking about the war's progress, contemplating the impossible situation Japan faced. At 5:30 hours on April 18, 1943, Yamamoto rose, dressed in his formal uniform, and prepared to depart for Bin. He had no way of knowing that 435 miles to the southeast, 18 American pilots were starting their engines, preparing to kill him in the most carefully planned assassination in military history. The two forces, hunter and hunted, were converging on a point in the sky over Bougainville Island. The intercept would occur in 2 hours, and history would remember April 18th, 1943 as the day America crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. 7:10 hours. Henderson Field, Guadalcanal. Major Mitchell's P-38 Lightning rolled down the runway and lifted into the morning sky. Behind him, 17 more P-38s followed at precise intervals. One aircraft every 30 seconds, maintaining formation discipline even during takeoff. The mission required exact timing from the very beginning. The P-38s climbed to 10,000 feet, then descended rapidly to wave-top altitude, 50 feet above the ocean surface. At that height, they would be invisible to Japanese radar installations on New Georgia and Bougainville. But flying at 50 feet required absolute concentration. A moment of inattention, a slight misjudgment of altitude, and an aircraft would hit the water at 200 miles per hour, disintegrating instantly. Mitchell led the formation northwest on a heading of 290 degrees. Navigation was by compass and Mitchell's wristwatch. He had calculated precise waypoints and times. 30 minutes after departure, they should be 100 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. 60 minutes after departure, they should be 200 miles out. 90 minutes they should be approaching Vela La Vela Island. Radio silence was absolute. No communication between aircraft. No radio navigation aids. If a pilot became lost or disoriented, he was on his own. There would be no radio calls for help, no vectors from ground controllers. The only option was to continue following the formation leader and trust that navigation was accurate. Lieutenant Raymond Hines, P-38, developed mechanical problems 45 minutes into the flight. His port engine began running rough, losing power. He tried adjusting mixture and throttle, but the engine continued to malfunction. At wave-top altitude with a failing engine, continuing the mission was suicidal. Hines reluctantly pulled up, climbed to altitude, and turned back toward Henderson Field. The killer flight was now reduced to 3 aircraft. 10 minutes later, Lieutenant Besby Holmes discovered that his external fuel tanks were not feeding properly. He was burning internal fuel faster than planned. Without fuel from the external tanks, he would not have enough range to reach the intercept point and return to Henderson. He also aborted, climbing away from the formation and heading back to base. The killer flight was now down to 2 aircraft, Lanphier and Barber. They would have to attack Yamamoto's transport alone, without backup, while Mitchell's 14 aircraft engaged 60 escorts. The odds had just gotten significantly worse. But Mitchell maintained course and speed. The mission would continue. They had come too far, risked too much, to abort now. At 9:33 hours, 2 hours and 23 minutes after departure, Mitchell spotted land ahead, the southern coast of Bougainville Island. His navigation had been nearly perfect. They were approximately 3 miles south of the planned intercept point. Mitchell pulled up slightly, scanning the sky. The formation was exactly where it needed to be, exactly when it needed to be there. Now, they just needed Yamamoto to appear. And then Lieutenant Doug Canning, flying cover, spotted them. 2 Betty bombers at 4,500 feet, heading south toward Bend, with 60 fighters flying escort above and around them. Yamamoto's flight, exactly on schedule, exactly where intelligence had predicted. Mitchell clicked his radio transmit button once, the signal for attack. Lanphier and Barber broke away from the formation, accelerating toward the Betty bombers. Mitchell led the cover flight up toward the 0 escorts. Operation Vengeance had reached its climactic moment. The next 90 seconds would determine the outcome of months of intelligence work, days of mission planning, and 2.5 hours of precision flying. Everything converged on this moment. Codebreakers in Hawaii, admirals in Pearl Harbor and Washington, 18 pilots who had flown 435 miles across enemy territory, and 1 Japanese admiral whose death or survival would shape the remainder of the Pacific War. Captain Lanphier and Lieutenant Barber, flying in loose formation, accelerated toward the 2 Betty bombers. The aircraft were approximately 3 miles ahead, descending gradually toward an airfield. The 60 escorts were flying slightly above into the sides of the bombers, a standard protective formation that allowed the fighters to engage threats from multiple directions. But the Zeros were not expecting an attack. Japanese radar had not detected the American approach at wave-top altitude. The 0 pilots were flying a routine escort mission, protecting their admiral during a scheduled inspection tour. They had no reason to expect that American intelligence knew Yamamoto's itinerary, no reason to believe that American fighters could reach this far into Japanese-controlled territory. That surprise lasted approximately 15 seconds. Then one of the 0 pilots spotted the P-38s climbing toward the bombers and immediately broke toward them, followed instantly by the other 5 Zeros. The Japanese pilots understood immediately that this was not a random encounter. This was a deliberate intercept attempt, which meant the Americans somehow knew about Yamamoto's flight. Major Mitchell's cover flight climbed to engage the diving Zeros. The sky erupted into chaotic combat, 18 American P-38s versus 6 Japanese Zeros and 2 Betty bombers, all maneuvering violently at altitudes between sea level and 6,000 feet. Mitchell's cover flight succeeded in its primary objective. The Zeros engaged the cover aircraft instead of protecting the bombers. This gave Lanphier and Barber a clear path to attack the Bettys. But now Lanphier faced a decision. Which Betty carried Yamamoto? Intelligence had not specified which of the 2 aircraft the Admiral would be aboard. Both looked identical. Mitsubishi G-4M bombers in standard Japanese Navy configuration. One carried Yamamoto, the other carried his staff officers. Attacked the wrong aircraft, and Yamamoto might escape. Lanphier chose the lead Betty, the aircraft flying slightly ahead and to the left of the second bomber. It was a logical choice. Senior commanders typically fly and lead aircraft, but it was a guess made in seconds while closing at combined speeds exceeding 400 miles per hour. He lined up his attack, closed to approximately 1,000 feet, and opened fire with his 4.50 caliber machine guns and single 20mm cannon. The tracers converged on the Betty's right wing. Lanphier saw his round impacting, saw pieces of metal tearing away from the bomber's wing structure. The Betty did not explode. It did not catch fire immediately. It simply began to descend, slowly at first, then more rapidly as the pilot lost control. The bomber's right wing was severely damaged, the flight control cables likely severed, the structural integrity compromised. Lanphier pulled up, climbing away from his target, unable to watch the bomber's final moments. He needed altitude, needed to check for Zero fighters that might be attacking him, needed to orient himself in the chaotic combat situation. Behind and below, Rex Barber followed his own attack run on the same Betty. He saw Lanphier's attack, saw the bomber descending, and fired his own burst into the aircraft's fuselage. His rounds raked the bomber from wing root to tail, punching to thin aluminum skin, destroying internal systems, killing or wounding personnel inside. The Betty rolled right, the damaged wing failing completely, and dove toward the jungle below. It struck the trees at high speed, approximately 500 feet inland from Ben's coastline, and exploded on impact. The wreckage burned, black smoke rising above the jungle canopy. 3 miles to the east, Besby Holmes, who had managed to resolve his fuel problems and catch up the mission, and Raymond Hine attacked the second Betty bomber over Ben Harbor. Their combined fire hit the bomber's fuel tanks. The aircraft exploded in midair, pieces of wreckage falling into the ocean. The entire attack lasted less than 2 minutes from initial contact to final bomber destruction. Both Bettys were down. All occupants were dead or dying. The mission's primary objective was accomplished. But at this moment, no one knew which Betty had carried Yamamoto. Lanphier thought he had attacked the lead bomber, but in the chaos of combat and confusion of overlapping attack runs, it was impossible to be certain which aircraft carried the Admiral. That question would not be answered for several days, not until Japanese recovery teams reached the crash sites and identified the bodies. But for now, the American pilot had more immediate concerns, escaping from the combat zone, fighting off Zero interceptors, and returning to Henderson Field before running out of fuel. The combat zone over Ben was chaos. Mitchell's cover flight tangled with 6 Zeros in swirling dogfights between sea level and 8,000 feet. P-38s had advantages in speed and diving power. Zeros had advantages in turning radius and climb rate. The combat was violent, confused, and extremely dangerous for both sides. Lieutenant Besby Holmes, after attacking the second Betty, found himself pursued by 2 Zeros. He dove toward the ocean, accelerating his P-38 to maximum speed, over 400 miles per hour. The Zeros followed, but could not match the lightning speed in a straight-line dive. Holmes leveled off at wave-top altitude and continued accelerating, gradually pulling away from his pursuers. But his fuel situation was critical. He had burned significantly more fuel than planned. First during his aborted attempt to join the mission, then catching up to formation, then during combat maneuvering. His fuel gauges showed less than 45 minutes remaining. Henderson Field was 435 miles away. At maximum cruise speed, the return flight would take over 2 hours. Holmes reduced power, leaned his fuel mixture to maximum economy, and began the long flight home knowing he would almost certainly run out of fuel before reaching Henderson. His only hope was that a Navy destroyer might be patrolling somewhere along the return route. He could ditch near the ship, survive the water landing, and be rescued before sharks or exposure killed him. Captain Lanphier faced similar concerns. He had burned significant fuel during the approach flight, burned more during combat, and now faced a 400-plus mile return flight. He calculated that he had perhaps 20 minutes more fuel than Holmes, enough to reach Henderson if conditions were perfect, not enough if anything went wrong. Lieutenant Rex Barber was in better condition. He had flown more conservatively during the approach, had not made extensive combat maneuvers, and had maintained better fuel discipline throughout. He estimated he had perhaps 90 minutes of fuel remaining, tight but probably sufficient. Major Mitchell assembled the surviving P-38s and began the return flight. Of the 18 aircraft that had departed Henderson Field, 2 had aborted early and 1 was missing, Lieutenant Raymond Hine had disappeared during the combat over Bin, presumably shot down by Zeros or crashed into the ocean. The remaining 15 aircraft headed southeast toward Guadalcanal. The return flight was tense and exhausting. Pilots had already been flying for over 2 hours. Combat adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by fatigue and the grinding tension of fuel anxiety. Every pilot watched his fuel gauges obsessively, calculating remaining fuel versus estimated distance to Henderson, knowing that miscalculation meant death. Besby Holmes's P-38 ran out of fuel approximately 80 miles short of Henderson Field. His engine sputtered, coughed, and died. The twin-engine fighter became a glider, descending inexorably toward the ocean below. Holmes radioed his position, breaking radio silence because he was about to die and wanted someone to know his final location. He set up his approach to the ocean surface, trying to time his landing for the moment between waves when the water was relatively smooth. At 150 miles per hour, he struck the surface. The P-38 hit hard, the cockpit immediately flooding. Holmes released his harness, pushed open the canopy, and fought his way out of the sinking aircraft. He surfaced, gasping, watching his P-38 sink into blue Pacific depths. He inflated his life raft, climbed aboard, and began the grim arithmetic of survival. He had emergency rations for 3 days, water for 2 days, and an ocean filled with sharks. His chances of rescue were small. He was 80 miles from Henderson, outside the normal patrol areas for Navy destroyers or PT boats. But luck intervened. A Navy PBY Catalina flying boat, returning from a patrol mission, spotted Holmes's life raft. The Catalina landed on the ocean, picked up Holmes, and delivered him back to Henderson Field 5 hours later. He would survive to fly combat missions for the rest of the war. The other 14 P-38s made it back to Henderson, though several landed with fuel tanks showing empty. Captain Lanphier's aircraft coasted onto the runway, engines failing from fuel exhaustion just as the wheels touched down. He had literally flown until the last drop of fuel was consumed. Mitchell assembled his pilots for immediate debriefing. The critical question: did they shoot down Yamamoto? Lanphier claimed he had attacked the lead bomber and shot it down. Barber said he had also attacked the lead bomber after Lanphier's pass. Holmes and Hine, before he disappeared, had attacked the second bomber. But in the confusion of combat, no one could state with certainty which bomber Yamamoto had been aboard. The mission would be classified as successful, both bombers destroyed, all occupants dead. But confirmation of Yamamoto's death would require intelligence from Japanese sources. American pilots would have to wait for the enemy to announce the Admiral's fate. At Bin Airfield, Japanese personnel watched in horror as the 2 Betty bombers were shot down. Ground-based anti-aircraft guns opened fire on the American P-38s, but the fighters were too fast, too maneuverable, and the attack was over too quickly for effective defensive fire. As soon as the American aircraft departed, Japanese Army troops were dispatched to locate the crash sites and attempt rescue of any survivors. The lead bomber had crashed inland, approximately 500 meters from the coast, in dense jungle. The second bomber had exploded over the harbor, wreckage scattered across the water. The jungle crash site was difficult to reach. Japanese troops hacked through dense vegetation, following smoke from the burning wreckage. When they reached the site, they found devastation. The bomber had struck the jungle at high speed, tearing through trees, disintegrating on impact, scattering wreckage over a wide area. The recovery team began searching for survivors or bodies. The bomber had carried 11 personnel, the crew of 9 pilot, co-pilot, flight engineer, radio operator, and 5 additional crew, plus 2 passengers. Most of the bodies were burned beyond recognition or dismembered by the impact, but one body was found relatively intact, still strapped in a seat that had been thrown clear of the main wreckage. The body wore the uniform of a Japanese admiral. The left hand was missing 2 fingers, a distinctive injury known to identify one person, Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. The recovery team officer, Lieutenant Hamasuna, immediately recognized the significance. He ordered his troops to secure the body with utmost care and to search for the admiral's personal effects. They recovered Yamamoto's samurai sword, his briefcase containing operational documents, and his personal diary. Hamasuna reported to his commander, Admiral Yamamoto had been killed in the crash. The time of death was estimated at 7:36 hours, 1 minute after the American attack began. The news was transmitted immediately to Rabaul, then to Combined Fleet Headquarters in Truk, then to Naval General Staff in Tokyo. The shock was profound. Yamamoto was irreplaceable, Japan's most competent naval commander, the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, the man who understood better than anyone else what Japan faced in the Pacific War. His death raised immediate questions. How had American fighters known about the Admiral's flight? How had they known the precise time, route, and aircraft? The obvious answer: Americans had broken Japanese codes, were considered but dismissed as impossible. The JN-25 cipher system was supposedly unbreakable. Alternative explanations were developed. Perhaps American coast watchers had spotted the Admiral's departure from Rabaul, radioed the information, and Henderson Field had scrambled fighters in time to intercept. Perhaps a spy at Rabaul had provided intelligence. Perhaps the Americans had gotten lucky. A random patrol that happened to encounter Yamamoto's flight at exactly the right time and place. These alternative explanations were comforting because they suggested the incident was a tragic coincidence rather than a systematic compromise of Japanese communications. But they were also wrong. Americans had indeed broken JN-25, had read Yamamoto's itinerary in decrypted radio traffic, and had planned Operation Vengeance based on that intelligence. The Japanese would not fully understand this until after the war ended, when American military historians revealed the role of code-breaking in the Pacific Campaign. But in April 1943, Japanese military leadership convinced themselves that Yamamoto's death was a terrible coincidence, not evidence of comprehensive intelligence failure. This belief was reinforced by American operational security. Details of Operation Vengeance were classified at the highest levels. Pilots were ordered never to discuss the mission specifics. Official announcements credited the success to routine patrol rather than planned assassination. This deception helped protect the secret of broken Japanese codes, allowing American intelligence to continue reading enemy communications throughout the war. Japanese Imperial General Headquarters faced a difficult decision: announce Yamamoto's death immediately or delay the announcement to maintain morale and prevent Americans from understanding that they had successfully assassinated Japan's most senior naval commander. The argument for immediate announcement was that Yamamoto's death could not be concealed indefinitely. Too many people knew. The recovery team, base commanders at Rabaul and Bin, staff officers at Combined Fleet Headquarters. Delaying the announcement might lead to rumors, speculation, and loss of credibility when the truth eventually emerged. The argument for delay was that Yamamoto's death would devastate Japanese military morale. He was not just a commander. He was a symbol of Japanese naval power, a legendary figure whose competence and leadership inspired confidence throughout the fleet. Announcing his death would admit that Japan had lost its best naval commander at a critical moment in the war. The decision was made to delay the announcement for over 3 weeks. During this period, Japanese military censors suppressed any rumors about Yamamoto's fate. Official communications continued to reference the Admiral as if he were alive and actively commanding operations. Meanwhile, Americans waited for confirmation. Radio intelligence monitored Japanese communications for any indication that Yamamoto had been killed. Captain Lanphier and Lieutenant Barber waited to learn whether their mission had succeeded. On May 21, 1943, 33 days after Operation Vengeance, Japanese Imperial Headquarters issued an official announcement. Fleet Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had been killed in action on April 18th while inspecting frontline bases in the Solomon Islands. A state funeral would be held in Tokyo on June 5th. The announcement confirmed what American intelligence had suspected. Operation Vengeance had succeeded. Admiral Yamamoto was dead, killed in a carefully planned ambush based on decrypted communications. The announcement also revealed something unexpected: the extent to which Yamamoto's death affected Japanese national morale. The funeral in Tokyo drew over 1 million mourners. Emperor Hirohito personally awarded Yamamoto posthumous promotion to Fleet Admiral. He had already held a rank, but the posthumous promotion carried symbolic significance. Newspaper editorials described the Admiral as irreplaceable, a hero who had given his life for Japan. American intelligence analysts studied the Japanese reaction and concluded that Yamamoto's death had achieved its strategic objective. Japan had lost its most competent naval commander, and replacing him would be difficult if not impossible. The immediate tactical aftermath of Operation Vengeance was clear. Both Betty bombers destroyed, Yamamoto and his chief of staff killed. The mission accomplished with minimal American losses. 1 P-38 shot down, 1 pilot rescued. But the strategic and moral implications would unfold over months and years, shaping not just the Pacific War, but also American military doctrine for decades to come. The most immediate strategic question was, who would replace Yamamoto as Commander-in-Chief of Combined Fleet? Japanese Naval General Staff faced a difficult reality that no officer possessed Yamamoto's combination of strategic vision, tactical competence, personal leadership, and understanding of modern naval warfare. The position went to Admiral Manaichi Koga, 57, a competent officer, but lacking Yamamoto's brilliance. Koga had served primarily in administrative and training positions. He had not commanded a fleet in combat. He did not have Yamamoto's deep understanding of American industrial capacity and strategic thinking, and he did not have the respect and trust that Yamamoto had earned throughout the Navy. Koga's appointment was essentially recognition that Yamamoto was irreplaceable. Rather than choosing a commander who might attempt bold strategic initiatives and risk catastrophic failure, Japanese leadership chose a cautious administrator who would preserve the fleet while awaiting opportunities that never came. American intelligence analysts assessed Koga's appointment and concluded that Operation Vengeance had achieved exactly what was intended. Yamamoto's death had degraded Japanese naval leadership quality at a critical moment. This assessment was supported by subsequent events. Under Koga's command, the combined fleet fought several major engagements, Philippine Sea, Leyte Gulf, and lost decisively in each case, suffering catastrophic losses of aircraft carriers, battleships, and experienced pilots that Japan could not replace. Whether Yamamoto could have prevented these defeats is unknowable. He understood Japan's strategic situation better than his successors and might have conserved forces more effectively. But by April 1943, Japan's position was already deteriorating beyond recovery. American industrial production was overwhelming Japanese capacity to replace losses. American submarines were strangling Japanese supply lines. American forces were advancing across the Pacific on multiple fronts simultaneously. Yamamoto's death did not change Japan's ultimate defeat. That outcome was virtually certain by mid-1943. But his death accelerated the defeat by perhaps 6 months to a year, as Japanese naval operations became less effective, more predictable, and increasingly desperate under leadership that lacked Yamamoto's strategic sophistication. Within days of returning from Operation Vengeance, a dispute emerged among the pilots about who deserved credit for shooting down Yamamoto's aircraft. This dispute would last decades and would never be fully resolved. Captain Thomas Lanphier claimed that he had shot down the lead bomber, the aircraft carrying Yamamoto. His combat report stated that he had attacked the lead bomber, struck it with machine gun and cannon fire, and observed it crash into the jungle. He therefore claimed credit for killing Yamamoto. Lieutenant Rex Barber claimed that he had also attacked the lead bomber after Lanphier's pass, that his fire had been more accurate and more damaging, and that the bomber crashed as a result of his attack, not Lanphier's. Barber's combat report supported this version of events. The dispute became contentious because combat credits affected promotion potential, public recognition, and post-war reputation. Lanphier aggressively promoted his version of events, giving interviews to reporters, writing magazine articles, and accepting speaking engagements where he described himself as the man who shot down Yamamoto. Barber, quieter and less interested in publicity, found Lanphier's claims offensive and inaccurate. He believed Lanphier was taking credit that properly belonged to him. The dispute created lasting bitterness between the two pilots. The truth is probably that both pilots attacked the same bomber, that both scored hits, and that the combined damage from both attacks caused a crash. But assigning specific credit is impossible from combat reports and pilot testimony. The combat lasted less than 2 minutes, occurred at high speed and chaotic conditions, and was observed from multiple conflicting perspectives. Official records eventually credited both Lanphier and Barber with shared credit for destroying Yamamoto's aircraft. This compromise satisfied neither pilot, but was probably the fairest resolution given the ambiguous evidence. The larger point, often lost in the credit dispute, was that Operation Vengeance succeeded because of coordination between 18 pilots, supported by hundreds of intelligence analysts, maintenance personnel, planners, and commanders. Lanphier and Barber were the trigger pullers, but the mission's success depended on collective efforts spanning months of preparation and execution. Beyond immediate tactical success and the moral controversies, Operation Vengeance had measurable strategic impact on the Pacific War's progression. Yamamoto's replacement, Admiral Koga, lacked a strategic vision to effectively counter American advances. Under Koga's command, Japanese naval forces fought several major engagements in 1943 to 1944 and lost decisively in each case. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 1944, Japanese carriers launched 373 aircraft against American carrier task forces. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 315 Japanese aircraft, over 84% of the attacking force, while losing only 29 American aircraft. The one-sided slaughter became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japanese naval aviation never recovered. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, October 1944, Japanese forces attempted a complex three-pronged attack to destroy American invasion forces at Leyte Island in the Philippines. The operation failed catastrophically, with Japan losing 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, and 10 cruisers. After Leyte Gulf, the Japanese Navy ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. Whether Yamamoto could have prevented these defeats is speculative, but his understanding of American capabilities, his willingness to conserve forces when appropriate, and his strategic sophistication suggest he might have avoided the worst losses. At minimum, he would likely have not committed to desperate, complex operations that Koga authorized, and that resulted in irreplaceable losses of ships and experienced pilots. American intelligence estimates suggest that Operation Vengeance shortened the Pacific War by approximately 6 months to 1 year. This calculation was based on the degradation of Japanese naval leadership quality, the accelerated losses of Japanese naval forces under Koga's command, and the more rapid American advance across the Pacific that these factors enabled. If accurate, this estimate means Operation Vengeance potentially saved tens of thousands of American lives that would have been lost in combat during those additional months of war. It also means hundreds of thousands of Japanese military and civilian lives were saved by earlier war termination. These calculations are necessarily imprecise and speculative, but the underlying logic is sound. Better leadership extends wars, worse leadership shortens them. Yamamoto was better leadership. Killing him shortened the war. 80 years after Operation Vengeance, the mission remains one of the most significant targeted killings in military history. Its legacy extends across multiple dimensions: military doctrine, intelligence operations, international law, and moral philosophy. Military doctrine. Operation Vengeance established that modern intelligence capabilities enable targeting of individual enemy commanders with precision that was impossible in previous conflicts. This capability fundamentally changed how militaries think about leadership decapitation strategies. If you can read enemy communications, track enemy movements, and deliver forces precisely to intercept targets, then targeted killing of enemy leadership becomes a viable strategic option. Intelligence operations. The mission demonstrated the strategic value of signals intelligence and cryptanalysis. The ability to read Japanese communications provided not just tactical advantage but strategic opportunity. This reinforced American investment in intelligence capabilities throughout and after World War II, leading to the creation of the National Security Agency, massive expansion of signals intelligence infrastructure, and development of increasingly sophisticated code-breaking capabilities. International law. Operation Vengeance contributed to the development of legal frameworks for targeted killing during armed conflict. Post-war legal scholars studying the mission helped develop doctrines distinguishing lawful targeting of military commanders from unlawful assassination. These frameworks were later incorporated into Geneva Conventions and remain foundational to contemporary law of armed conflict. Moral philosophy. The mission forced American leadership to confront difficult questions about the morality of targeted killing. These questions have never been fully resolved and continue to generate debate whenever America conducts similar operations. Operation Vengeance was the first time America explicitly authorized assassination of an enemy leader based on intelligence interception. It would not be the last. The pilots who flew Operation Vengeance lived with complex legacies. Thomas Lanphier survived the war, pursued military and civilian aviation careers, and died in 1987 at age 68, never fully resolving his dispute with Rex Barber over credit for Yamamoto's death. Barber also survived the war, became a successful businessman, and died in 2001 at age 84, embittered by what he considered Lanphier's undeserved credit for the mission. Major John Mitchell, the mission commander whose navigation and leadership made Operation Vengeance possible, received less public recognition than the pilots who actually shot down Yamamoto. He continued flying combat missions throughout the war, retired from the Air Force as a colonel, and died in 1995 at age 79, largely forgotten except by military historians who understood his critical role. The mission's true hero may have been Commander Joseph Rochefort, the codebreaker whose team at Station HYPO intercepted and decrypted the intelligence that enabled Operation Vengeance. Rochefort received little public recognition during his lifetime. His work was classified for decades, but he arguably contributed more to Allied victory in the Pacific than any single combat commander. He died in 1976 at age 76, finally receiving public recognition only years after his death when the cryptanalytic breakthrough was declassified. In the end, Operation Vengeance must be evaluated on multiple levels. Tactically, the mission was brilliantly executed. 18 fighters flew 435 miles over enemy territory, navigated with perfect precision, arrived within seconds of predicted intercept time, destroyed both target aircraft, and returned with only one loss. This represents extraordinary coordination, skill, and execution. Strategically, the mission achieved its objective of eliminating Japan's most competent naval commander at a critical moment. Japanese naval leadership quality declined after Yamamoto's death, contributing to accelerated Japanese losses and shorter war duration. Morally, the mission raised difficult questions about targeted assassination that remain unresolved 80 years later. Was killing Yamamoto justified? Was it honorable? Did it establish precedents that America should be proud of or troubled by? Historically, Operation Vengeance demonstrated that modern intelligence capabilities enable military operations that were impossible in previous conflicts. The mission marked a turning point in how warfare will be conducted in the modern age. Not just armies fighting armies, but intelligence services identifying specific individuals and military forces executing precision targeting to kill those individuals. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto died at 7:36 hours on April 18, 1943, in the jungle near Ben on Bougainville Island, killed by American fighter pilots acting on intelligence derived from broken Japanese codes. He was 59 years old. He had served in the Imperial Japanese Navy for 39 years. He had tried to prevent war with America, had warned that the war was unwinnable, and had been proven correct. His death shortened the war he had not wanted to fight, saved lives on both sides, and established precedents that continue to shape military operations 8 decades later. The mission that killed him was called Operation Vengeance, a name that acknowledged the emotional dimension of targeted assassination. But whether the mission was primarily about vengeance, or primarily about strategy, or primarily about demonstrating American technological and intelligence capabilities, remains contested. What is indisputable is that on April 18, 1943, 18 American pilots flew one of the most significant combat missions in military history, executing a plan that depended on broken codes, perfect navigation, precise timing, and extraordinary skill. They succeeded, and the Pacific War was changed forever.